On January 21st, 2008, one of the most powerful men in the Sinaloa Cartel was arrested in his underwear, in his own house, at 3 a.m, without a single shot fired, no struggle, no warning, just gone. Now that's not a lucky raid. You don't catch someone of that level, that cleanly, in the middle of the night, unless someone told you exactly where to find him, exactly which house, exactly which night, exactly when he'd have his guard completely down. And here's the thing, the man everyone suspected of making that call wasn't a rival, wasn't law enforcement, wasn't someone on the outside. It was his own partner, his cousin by marriage, the man he'd broken out of prison 7 years earlier, El Chapo. And if that accusation is even partially true, it means the most dangerous cartel split in Mexican history wasn't started by a war. It was started by a birthday party, a sleeping man, and a phone call. Stay with me until the end of this video, because by the time we're done, you're going to understand exactly how the Beltrán Leyva brothers and El Chapo went from blood brothers building the most powerful criminal empire in the Western Hemisphere to trying to destroy each other completely. Now, before we get into all of this, I want to give you some context, because if you're unaware of how the Sinaloa Cartel even worked, a lot of this story isn't going to hit the way it should. Because this isn't just a story about two groups of drug traffickers falling out. This is a story about family, loyalty, marriage alliances, and a power structure so tightly woven together that when it finally broke, it didn't just split one cartel in two, it reshaped the entire criminal landscape of Mexico for the next decade, and honestly, up to today. The term cartel gets thrown around a lot, and I think people sometimes imagine these organizations as like these random gangs that just happen to sell drugs. But the Sinaloa Cartel at its peak was more like a corporation, a brutal, violent, criminal corporation. But a corporation. It had a hierarchy, it had departments, it had roles, it had alliances. And the Beltrán Leyva brothers weren't just members, they were executives. They were the security division, the enforcement arm, the people who made sure the whole thing ran without getting picked apart by rivals. So for this video, when I say betrayal, I'm not using that word loosely. I mean a calculated, deliberate act where one man apparently handed his own partner, his cousin by marriage, a man who had broken him out of prison, over to the Mexican military. And I mean the consequences that followed. A war that killed thousands of people, toppled some of the most powerful figures in Mexican organized crime, and left a family empire in ruins. So today we're going to go through the full story. We're going to start with how the Beltrán Leyva brothers and El Chapo came to power together, how the Federation was built, what caused the tensions to build up underneath the surface, what exactly happened on January 21st, 2008, and then how that single night lit a fuse that burned through both organizations for years. Let's get into it. So let's start at the beginning, because the story of the Beltrán Leyva brothers and El Chapo doesn't start in 2008. It starts decades earlier in a place called Badiraguato, a municipality in the mountains of Sinaloa, Mexico, sitting right in the middle of what's known as the Golden Triangle. And if you don't know what the Golden Triangle is, it's basically this region between Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua that has been the epicenter of Mexican drug production for generations. Poppy fields, marijuana fields, mountains that make it incredibly difficult for law enforcement to operate. It's the kind of place where kids grow up knowing what the trade is before they know anything else. And that's exactly where Arturo, Carlos, Alfredo, Hector, and their other brother Mario Alberto Beltrán Leyva grew up. 5 brothers, all born into the Sinaloan countryside in the 1960s and 70s. Arturo was the eldest, the most ambitious, the one who would eventually become the face of the whole operation. His nickname was El Barbas, the bearded one. Then there was Alfredo, El Mochomo, which translates to the desert ant. There was Carlos, El Charlie, and Hector, known as LH. Now Joaquin Guzman Loera, El Chapo, also came from Badiraguato. Same mountains, same villages, same world. He and the Beltrán Leyva brothers grew up in the same ecosystem. So when you hear people describe their relationship as cousins, understand that in that world, that word carries a weight that goes beyond blood. It means shared roots, shared risks, shared loyalty, at least in theory. In the early days before they latched onto El Chapo, the Beltrán Leyva brothers actually worked for a different boss entirely. They were enforcers and bodyguards for Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who ran the Juarez Cartel and was one of the most powerful drug traffickers Mexico had ever seen. They called him El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies, because he famously used a fleet of Boeing 727s to move cocaine. The man was moving so much product that he became a legend while he was still alive. But Amado Carrillo Fuentes died in 1997, reportedly from complications during a cosmetic surgery he was using to change his appearance and go into hiding. And his death created a vacuum. The Juarez cartel was still around, but the era of that particular kind of dominance was over. And the Beltrán Leyva brothers, like a lot of people in that world, started recalculating their options. That's when they moved closer to El Chapo. And El Chapo at this point was already a major figure. He'd been building the Sinaloa Cartel into a powerhouse throughout the late 80s and 90s. He was arrested in 1993 and thrown in prison, but even from behind bars, he was conducting business. And it was during that prison stretch that the Beltrán Leyva brothers showed where their loyalty was. They reportedly brought him suitcases of cash to keep operations running. They maintained his networks. They kept the machine going while the boss was locked up. And in 2001, when El Chapo made his now legendary escape from the Puente Grande maximum security prison, supposedly hidden in a laundry cart, though the full story is debated, the Beltrán Leyva brothers were part of the infrastructure that made that possible. Whether they bribed guards, coordinated the escape route, or simply had people on the ground, they were involved. And that kind of thing creates a bond that goes beyond business. When you help a man walk out of a Mexican max security prison, that man owes you something. By the early 2000s, the Sinaloa Cartel was already powerful, but El Chapo had an even bigger vision. In 2002, he did something that had never really been done before at that scale. He brought together 25 of the largest drug trafficking organizations in Mexico under one umbrella. They called it the Federation, and some sources describe it with another phrase, the Alianza de Sangre, the Blood Alliance. Think about what that means for a second. 25 criminal organizations, all of them with their own bosses, their own territories, their own pride, agreeing to work together under a shared structure. That doesn't happen without serious negotiation, serious trust, and serious muscle. And the Beltrán Leyva brothers were right at the center of making it work. The key players in the Federation were El Chapo, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who was the quiet, strategic co-leader of Sinaloa, Juan José Esparragoza Moreno, known as El Azul, and the Carrillo Fuentes brothers from Juarez. And woven through all of it were the Beltrán Leyvas, serving as what you might call the enforcement division. Their role was to be the security force, the people who handled threats, managed violence, and kept the peace internally while making sure rivals on the outside understood what they were dealing with. To understand how the Beltrán Leyvas fit into this, you have to understand the structure of how these organizations counter each other. The Gulf Cartel, which was the Sinaloa Federation's main rival at the time, had made a move that changed the game in the late 90s. They recruited a group of elite deserters from the Mexican Army's Special Forces and turned them into their personal enforcement arm. They called them Los Zetas. And Los Zetas were not regular cartel enforcers. These were trained soldiers who brought military-grade tactics and discipline to cartel violence in a way that hadn't existed before. So the Beltrán Leyva brothers essentially said, "We'll do the same thing on our side." Inspired by the Zetas model, they started building their own armed wing. And the person they recruited to lead it was a guy who would become one of the most notorious figures in the entire cartel war. Edgar Valdez Villarreal, better known as La Barbie. Now, La Barbie is a wild story on his own. He was born in Laredo, Texas, an American actually, and he got that nickname because of his blonde hair and blue eyes. He didn't look like what people pictured when they thought of a cartel enforcer, but he was absolutely brutal, absolutely effective, and completely loyal to the Beltrán Leyvas. His first major assignment was to take the city of Nuevo Laredo from the Gulf Cartel and their Zetas. He failed, ultimately, but in trying, he matched the Zetas act for act in terms of violence and made it clear that the Beltrán Leyva arm of the Federation wasn't going to be pushed around. And that's what the Beltrán Leyvas did for El Chapo. They were his enforcers, his muscle, his security architects. Without them, a lot of the Federation's ability to hold territory and intimidate rivals simply wouldn't have existed in the same way. Now, at the same time, the ties between the families weren't just professional, they were personal. Alfredo Beltrán Leyva, El Mochomo, married one of El Chapo's cousins. In the world they lived in, that kind of marriage wasn't just romantic. It was a business merger. It meant these families were literally linked by blood. And El Chapo and Alfredo reportedly referred to each other as cousins and genuinely operated like family. By 2007, a Ministry of National Defense assessment of Mexico's cartels concluded something that had to have made El Chapo uncomfortable. After the Sinaloa Cartel, the Beltrán Leyva organization was the second largest criminal presence in the country, with cells in 16 different states. 16 states. They had their own armed groups with their own names. At the rate they were growing, some analysts believed they could surpass Sinaloa's influence within a few years. And here is where the tension starts to build. Because in that world, there can only be one boss. And El Chapo was not the kind of man who tolerated the idea of being surpassed, even by people he called cousins. Now look, I want to be fair here, because the split between El Chapo and the Beltrán Leyvas didn't come out of nowhere. There were cracks in the alliance for years, before January 2008. And I think it's important to lay those out, because the arrest of Alfredo wasn't just the cause, it was the detonator on a bomb that had been built over a long time. The first major crack came in 2004. The Federation had been formed around a shared enemy, the Gulf Cartel, and around a shared financial interest. But agreements between criminal organizations are only as strong as the trust between the people running them. And in 2004, a double homicide against El Chapo's gunman was allegedly ordered by the Carrillo Fuentes brothers from Juarez. That created a rift between the Sinaloa side and the Juarez side. The Beltrán Leyvas stepped into this gap and offered to deepen their role as the security faction, essentially positioning themselves as the glue holding the Federation together. But here's the thing. When you're the glue, you're also the leverage, and the Beltrán Leyvas knew it. There was also a dispute over routes, specifically the drug trafficking corridor from the Pacific Coast up to Chicago. This was an enormously profitable route. We're talking about one of the most lucrative pipelines in North American drug distribution. And there were growing disagreements within the Federation about who controlled what and who got what cut of the proceeds. These kinds of disputes are almost impossible to resolve cleanly in a criminal organization because there's no contract you can take to court. It's all enforced through trust and through the threat of violence. And then there's the lifestyle issue. Now, I'm not trying to say this is the main reason everything fell apart, but it's worth mentioning because it's something that kept coming up in how this situation was described. El Chapo, despite being one of the most wanted men in the world, was famously low-key in terms of his public profile. He stayed in the mountains. He moved constantly. He was hard to find because he made himself hard to find. The Beltrán Leyvas, particularly Arturo and Alfredo, operated a little differently. They were seen at parties. They were photographed with celebrities, with soap opera actresses, with famous regional musicians. Alfredo in particular was known for this kind of lifestyle. And in a world where staying alive means staying invisible, that kind of visibility is a liability, not just for yourself, for everyone around you. According to one account, El Chapo specifically knew that Alfredo Beltrán Leyva had a very particular weakness. He could not resist celebrating. Whether it was a birthday, an anniversary, a party, El Mochomo would throw it. And he would be present. And he would be relaxed. And he would be surrounded by women. And El Chapo, allegedly, used exactly that knowledge when the time came. So here is where it gets really interesting, and by interesting, I mean absolutely insane. January 21st, 2008. Culiacan, Sinaloa. It's Alfredo Beltrán Leyva's 37th birthday. According to the accounts that have come out since, El Chapo knew his cousin had a habit of celebrating his birthday with a woman. He'd throw a party, or he'd be with someone. And by the time the night was over, he'd be completely exhausted. Deep asleep. Not alert, not on guard, just a man who'd had a long night. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, troops from the 9th Military Zone surrounded his house in Culiacan, Sinaloa. And here's the detail that tells you everything you need to know about what kind of tip-off this was. They didn't have to fire a single shot. He never heard them coming. He was arrested in his underwear, on his birthday, without a struggle. That's not a lucky raid. That's not the army stumbling across a mid-level cartel figure. When you arrest someone of Alfredo's level, in that manner, with that precision, someone talked. Someone told the military the exact house, the exact night, the exact moment when he would be most off guard. When he was taken in, authorities found 2 suitcases filled with $900,000 in cash and luxury watches. They found 20 fragmentation grenades, rifles, automatic weapons, 40 bullet-resistant vests, 8 of which had the letters FEDA on them, which stood for Fuerzas Especiales de Arturo, Arturo's Special Forces. This wasn't a low-level arrest. This was the capture of a major operational leader of one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the Western Hemisphere. Alfredo was flown to Mexico City and put in Altiplano, one of Mexico's most secure federal prisons. Now his brothers waited to see what would happen. And then, the thing that sealed it came. Weeks after Alfredo was arrested, El Chapo's son, Archivaldo Guzman, who had himself been locked up, was released from prison on a technicality. Just walked out. I want you to think about how that looked from the Beltrán Leyva brothers' perspective. Their brother is sitting in a maximum security federal prison on his 37th birthday, arrested in his underwear at 3 in the morning by troops who somehow knew exactly where to find him. And El Chapo's son, who should be behind bars, is suddenly free on a technicality. The brothers accused El Chapo of giving Alfredo's location to the federal government. The theory, which has been reported by multiple outlets covering this story, was that El Chapo made a deal, or at the very least passed intelligence, to get Alfredo off the street. Why? Because Alfredo was becoming too powerful, too visible. The Beltrán Leyvas as a whole were growing too big, too fast, and El Chapo needed to cut the branch before it outgrew the tree. Now I want to be clear. This was never definitively confirmed in a courtroom. El Chapo never admitted to this specific act. Some analysts have argued the arrest could have been a coincidence, or the result of Mexican military intelligence operating independently. But in the cartel world, suspicion is evidence. And the Beltrán Leyva brothers weren't going to wait around for a confession. Within months of Alfredo's arrest, the Beltrán Leyva brothers made their decision official. They were out. They were no longer part of the Sinaloa Cartel. They were no longer aligned with El Chapo or El Mayo Zambada. They were going to build their own independent organization, the Beltrán Leyva Organization, the BLO. And they were going to war. Led by Arturo, who now started calling himself El Jefe de Jefes, the boss of bosses. The BLO didn't just quietly slip away. They made their position clear through violence. And their first major move was one of the most personal acts of retaliation possible. In May 2008, a group of roughly 20 gunmen intercepted Edgar Guzman Lopez, El Chapo's 22-year-old son, as he was leaving a shopping mall in Culiacan. They killed him, right there, in a shopping center parking lot. Let me just pause on that for a second, because going after someone's child is a line that even in the cartel world is understood to be a serious escalation. You're not just sending a message about business, you're making it personal. You're telling El Chapo, we can reach your family. We know where they are. We don't care about the rules. And Arturo's rationale was equally personal. He lost his brother. El Chapo took his brother away. So he took El Chapo's son. But the Beltrán Leyvas weren't just targeting Chapo's family. Arturo went after the entire system that he felt had been complicit in the betrayal. He targeted high-ranking government officials, police commanders, and intelligence figures who were on the cartel's payroll and who, the BLO believed, had helped facilitate Alfredo's arrest. In April 2008, Arturo ordered the assassination of Edgar Eusebio Millán Gómez, the commissioner of the federal police, essentially Mexico's top cop, shot multiple times outside his home in Mexico City. A man of that rank being killed in the capital sent shockwaves through the entire Mexican government and made clear that the BLO was not a regional concern. They were a national threat. Also targeted, Noé Ramírez Mandujano, Mexico's drug czar, the head of the National Investigative Agency. He wasn't killed, but he was arrested and later convicted. Turns out he had been receiving $450,000 per month from the organization. Per month. And when the Beltrán Leyvas turned against their allies, they exposed everything. Informants, officials, intelligence networks. All of it started unraveling. The violence in Culiacan alone during this period was staggering. The capital of Sinaloa State became one of the most dangerous cities in Mexico almost overnight. Bodies were found daily. Narco banners threatening retaliation were hung from bridges and on public buildings. One was placed on a kindergarten, for which they also reportedly set part of the school on fire as a warning. This was the nature of what the BLO was doing. Maximum intimidation, maximum pressure, maximum chaos. Meanwhile, the Beltrán Leyvas formalized their alliance with Los Zetas, the very same organization they'd once fought against as part of Sinaloa's army. This is something worth sitting with for a moment. The Beltrán Leyvas had spent years battling the Zetas on behalf of El Chapo. La Barbie had fought them in Nuevo Laredo, and now they were partners. In the cartel world, there are no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. This new alliance made the BLO exponentially more dangerous. The Zetas brought military training, a willingness to use extreme violence publicly and visibly, and connections across eastern Mexico that the BLO didn't have on its own. And the BLO brought money, infrastructure, trafficking routes, and a level of political corruption that even the Zetas hadn't fully built at that point. The result was a war that spread across Mexico, from Culiacan to Mexico City, from Guerrero to Tamaulipas, and left thousands of people dead over the next few years. By late 2009, Arturo was one of Mexico's 24 most wanted drug lords. The government had a $2.1 million reward on his head. He was being tracked constantly, and yet he was still living like a man who believed he was untouchable. December 2009, he hosted a Christmas party in a luxury gated community in Cuernavaca. He hired famous regional musicians to perform. He brought in women. He had his guards around him. It was lavish. The Mexican Navy's elite special forces surrounded the compound during that party, and Arturo actually escaped that night. 3 gunmen were killed, 11 bodyguards were captured. Authorities found $280,000 in cash and 16 rifles. But El Barbas slipped out. 5 days later, 5 days, Navy intelligence tracked him down again, this time to another luxury apartment complex in Cuernavaca. What happened on December 16, 2009 was not a quiet arrest. About 200 Mexican Marines showed up. 2 Navy helicopters rappelled men onto the roof. 2 small Army tanks surrounded the building. Arturo's people fought back with everything they had. Roughly 20 fragmentation hand grenades were thrown to slow the Marines' advance. The shootout lasted 90 minutes. When it was over, Arturo Beltrán Leyva was dead. 3 of his gunmen were dead. A 4th had committed suicide. Among the items seized, $40,000 in cash, several thousand Canadian dollars, 5 assault rifles, 1 pistol, and a collection of religious scapulars and medallions. But here's the part that I genuinely could not believe when I read it. One of the Marines who died in that operation, a young Special Forces soldier named Melquisedec Angelo Cordova, was buried with full military honors on December 21st. He was a hero. He died doing his job. The very next day, December 22nd, a group of gunmen showed up and assassinated members of his family, including his mother. That was the BLO's message to anyone who crossed them. Win or lose, they would reach you. They would reach your family. They would reach the people you loved most. With Arturo dead, the organization entered a rapid spiral. December 30th, 2009, just 2 weeks after Arturo was killed, Carlos Beltrán Leyva was captured by federal police in Culiacán after he tried to pass himself off with a fake driver's license. 2 down. Hector Beltrán Leyva, LH, took over what was left, but he was leading a fractured organization. After the loss of Arturo and the ongoing imprisonment of Alfredo, the BLO began to break into competing factions. La Barbie and another lieutenant named Gerardo Alvarez Vasquez were leading one faction. Hector was leading another. Internal war broke out within the already at war BLO. La Barbie was arrested on August 30th, 2010, another massive blow. And then in 2014, Hector Beltrán Leyva, the last of the brothers still operating, was arrested in San Miguel de Allende. He'd apparently been living relatively quietly at that point, dining at a seafood restaurant when the police came. That was the end of the Beltrán Leyva brothers as a functioning leadership unit. The same year, Alfredo was extradited to the United States. He was taken to Washington, D.C. to face drug trafficking charges. He eventually pleaded guilty, admitted to coordinating massive cocaine shipments and running multiple methamphetamine laboratories in Sinaloa. Though even then, he tried to minimize his own role and pointed to Arturo as the true leader. The judge wasn't moved. On April 5, 2017, Alfredo Beltrán Leyva was sentenced to life in federal prison. He was ordered to forfeit $529 million to the U.S. government, a number based on at least 27.9 tons of narcotics shipped between 2000 and 2012. Let me just say that number again, 27.9 tons. Now, obviously, El Chapo's story after the split is its own entire saga, and I'll probably do a separate video on that at some point. But I want to touch on it here because the contrast between how the two sides of this conflict ended up is really striking. After the Beltrán Leyva brothers turned against him, El Chapo was in a genuinely difficult position. He'd lost the Sinaloa Cartel's most powerful enforcement arm. He'd triggered a war on 2 fronts, against the BLO and against their new Zeta allies. He had personal grief from the death of his son. And the Mexican government, now fully aware of the depths of corruption in its own institutions, was under enormous pressure to actually pursue these organizations seriously. But El Chapo survived. Not just survived, he consolidated. The Sinaloa Cartel, instead of fracturing without the Beltrán Leyva enforcement machine, adapted. New alliances were made. New enforcement structures were built. El Chapo continued operating, continued evading, continued building what would become the most geographically widespread drug trafficking operation in the Western Hemisphere. He was eventually captured in 2014, escaped again from prison in 2015 through a tunnel built under his cell. A mile-long tunnel with a motorcycle on rails, which is honestly one of the most absurd things I've ever heard, and was finally captured for the last time in 2016 and extradited to the United States in 2017. He was convicted in 2019 in Brooklyn on all counts: drug trafficking, conspiracy, murder conspiracy, and sentenced to life plus 30 years. He's currently in ADX Florence, the so-called Supermax prison in Colorado, in conditions described as some of the most restrictive in the American prison system. And here's the detail that ties all of this together in the strangest possible way. El Chapo and Alfredo Beltrán Leyva ended up using the same lawyer. Angel Eduardo Balareso, who had represented Alfredo during his federal trial, was later hired by El Chapo to handle his defense. Two men who had tried to destroy each other, who had ordered violence against each other's families, who represented opposite sides of one of the most brutal criminal conflicts in Mexican history, sharing the same attorney as they both fought the same government. If you wrote that as fiction, people would say it was too on the nose. So what happened to the BLO after all the brothers were gone? This is actually really important context because the collapse of the Beltrán Leyva organization didn't create peace. It created chaos. And chaos in the cartel world means violence, because when there's no clear authority, everyone is fighting everyone. At least 48 different fragmented armed groups emerged from what used to be the Beltrán Leyva organization. 48. You had Los Mazalecos operating in Sinaloa and Nayarit, still fighting the Sinaloa Cartel. You had La Barradora in Guerrero fighting the independent cartel of Acapulco, which was itself a BLO splinter. You had various other factions fighting each other over territories that had once been organized under one roof. In February 2010, the BLO and Los Zetas were engaged in a violent turf war in the border city of Reynosa against a new alliance of the Gulf Cartel, Sinaloa Cartel, and La Familia Cartel. Border towns were turning into ghost towns. The level of violence in that period in the border region was almost incomprehensible to people watching from outside. And the legacy of the BLO didn't end with the brothers, because Alfredo's son, who goes by the nickname El Mochomito, literally Little Desert Ant, is reportedly still active. He inherited the name, the grudges, and some of the infrastructure. He's also El Chapo's nephew by marriage, which makes the continuing feud a genuinely family affair in the most twisted possible way. Reports suggest he's been quietly aligning with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG, and encroaching back onto Sinaloa territory, Chapo's old turf. Coming back around. The blood feud apparently does not have an expiration date. Okay, so let's talk about the bigger picture here. Because I think what makes this story so fascinating beyond the drama and the violence is what it reveals about how these organizations actually work and why they're so structurally unstable, despite being so powerful. The Beltrán Leyvas and El Chapo had everything going for them. They had blood ties. They had years of shared history. They had a mutual interest in staying unified and making money. And yet, the alliance still collapsed. Why? I think there are a few reasons, and I want to be honest that these are my own observations, mixed with what analysts have written about this situation. The first reason is the problem of power without limits. In a legitimate business, if you grow too big and start threatening your partner, there are legal structures that force some kind of negotiation or restructuring. In the criminal world, there are no such structures. The only mechanism for rebalancing power is violence or betrayal. And El Chapo, if the accusations are true, chose betrayal because it was cleaner and more deniable than open war. He could remove a growing threat without looking like he fired the first shot. The second reason is lifestyle. The Beltrán Leyva's increasingly public profile wasn't just about ego, though there was probably some of that. It was a genuine liability. High-profile parties, celebrity connections, visible luxury. All of that makes you easier to surveil, easier to track, easier to leak information about. Alfredo being arrested without a single shot fired, at home, asleep, suggests that whoever tipped off the military knew not just where he was, but when he'd be most vulnerable. That level of information comes from close proximity. The third reason, and I think this is the one people underestimate, is that loyalty in these organizations is always conditional. The brotherhood, the family ties, the blood alliance, all of it is built on a foundation of mutual benefit. When one side starts to feel like the other is taking more than they're giving, or threatening the overall structure, the loyalty calculus changes. The Beltrán Leyvas thought they were partners. El Chapo, apparently, had already mentally reclassified them as a threat that needed managing. And the fourth reason is the corrupted state. The revelations that came out after the split about how deep cartel money had penetrated the Mexican government, from local cops all the way up to the drug czar receiving $450,000 a month, are honestly staggering. And the BLO's willingness to expose that corruption after the break was almost like a scorched earth policy. If we're going down, we're taking the whole system with us. The arrests of officials, the assassinations, the narco banners. It wasn't just violence, it was a statement about how rotten the entire structure was. The war between El Chapo and the Beltrán Leyva brothers wasn't just a cartel beef. Its ripple effects reshaped Mexico in ways that are still being felt today. The exposure of state corruption forced reforms, some real, some cosmetic, in how Mexico's security institutions operated. The fragmentation of the BLO created dozens of smaller, less organized, but equally violent groups that filled power vacuums across the country. Cities like Acapulco, which became a tourist destination again briefly in the 2010s, have since been devastated by exactly the kind of splinter group violence that emerged from the BLO collapse. The Zetas, emboldened by their alliance with the BLO and increasingly independent from the Gulf Cartel anyway, used the conflict to accelerate their own expansion across Mexico. They introduced a level of publicly visible brutality, videos of executions, decapitations, mass graves, that hadn't been a feature of the cartel landscape before and which defined the most horrific years of Mexico's drug war. And the Sinaloa Cartel, despite losing its enforcement arm and going through a brutal war, came out stronger, which is probably the most important strategic lesson of this entire story. El Chapo, by cutting off the Beltrán Leyvas before they could outgrow him, whether that was the calculation or not, preserved Sinaloa's dominance in a way that outlasted even his own imprisonment. The cartel he built is still one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the planet. The Beltrán Leyva brothers, for all their power, all their intelligence networks, all their political connections, all their violence, ended up in federal prisons in the United States, sentenced to life, ordered to forfeit hundreds of millions of dollars. Arturo is dead, killed in a 90-minute firefight against 200 Marines. Carlos was caught on a fake ID. Hector was eating at a seafood restaurant. The empire they built over decades collapsed in about 5 years. So here's where I land on all of this. The story of the Beltrán Leyva brothers and El Chapo is, at its core, a story about trust in a world where trust is both the most valuable and most fragile currency. They built something together that was genuinely unprecedented in scale. They shared a bloodline, a hometown, a history of survival. They helped each other when it mattered most. And then, allegedly, El Chapo handed his cousin over to the military in his underwear on his 37th birthday. And the world they had built together started burning. I can't say for certain whether El Chapo actually made that call. The evidence is circumstantial, compelling circumstantial evidence, but still. What I can say is that the Beltrán Leyva brothers believed it. And in that world, what you believe and how you respond to what you believe is the only thing that matters. Arturo Beltrán Leyva, El Barbas, El Jefe de Jefes, spent the last 2 years of his life trying to prove that betraying him was a mistake. That it would cost El Chapo more than it was worth. He launched one of the most violent internal cartel wars in Mexican history. He exposed the corruption of the Mexican state. He killed Chapo's son. He killed top federal officials. He turned the Zetas from enemies into allies. And in the end, he died in a luxury apartment in Cuernavaca, while 200 Marines rappelled from helicopters. The story of the Beltrán Leyva brothers is ultimately a story about how power corrodes loyalty and how the same qualities that make you dangerous, ambition, visibility, reputation, can also make you a target. Even to the people who are supposed to be on your side, especially to the people who are supposed to be on your side. In my opinion, the real lesson here isn't about cartels or drug trafficking. It's about what happens when the people around you start seeing you as competition instead of family. And what happens when you never see it coming. All right, that's gonna do it for this one. This was honestly one of the most complex stories I've dug into. There are so many layers to this that I had to cut a ton of material just to keep it focused. If you want me to go deeper on any specific part of this, whether that's the rise and fall of El Chapo himself, the story of La Barbie, or how Los Zetas used this conflict to become what they became, let me know in the comments, because I've got the research and I'd love to do those videos. Also, if you have other topics in this space you want me to cover, drop them below. I read the comments, and this is genuinely the kind of history that I find fascinating. The more obscure and undercovered, the better. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you actually learned something today, because this one took a minute to put together. This has been Your Name, and I'll see you guys next time.